Did you know that when astronauts return from space, they often report something called the return shock? A weird emotional crash that happens not during the launch, not during orbit, not even during re entry, but when they're finally home? Turns out, after you've literally left the planet, coming back to your old kitchen feels anticlimactic. Weird, right? But also extremely human. Welcome back, fellow mages, to the Grounded Mage, where we explore how myth and magic exist in everyday life. And today, season finale vibes! We are tackling one of the most underappreciated parts of the hero's journey, the return. Because, surprise, surprise, defeating the dragon, that's hard. Coming home after defeating the dragon, that's harder. Because the hero's journey doesn't just test your skills, it tests your identity. So, for the last time in 2025, let's get into it. If I asked you what you thought the hardest part of the hero story was, you'd probably tell me it's the climax. That's where the hero faces the biggest threat, almost dies, and then miraculously wins the fight. I mean, it does sound very exhausting. But storytellers and psychologists have always known the truth. Transformation is exhilarating, but reintegration is complicated. Let's look at Odysseus. If you haven't read the Odyssey by Homer, the ancient Greek poet, not Bart Simpson's dad, I highly recommend it. But here is a brief summary anyway, at least as brief as I can make it for something that ran for 24 books. Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, and he finishes fighting the war against the Trojans and has to make his way home. Now, the journey is exhausting and it tests everything about him, but mainly his cunning, his resolve, and his willpower. Think about this. He fights in the Trojan War for 10 whole years and then famously takes 10 more years to come home from it. On that journey, he encounters many things that prevent him from reaching his destination. All he wants is to be home with his wife and his son. Here are just some of the trials he has to go through on this journey. He's imprisoned by a cyclops, and then he's forced to blind it in order to get away from it. And little did he know he would regret this choice later because the cyclops was the son of Poseidon, and Poseidon is not the god that you want to piss off. Odysseus then has to sail past the island of Sirens, and he has to make his crew plug their ears with beeswax so they don't hear their fatal song. At some point, Zeus throws a thunderbolt which destroys Odysseus' ship and unalives his entire crew. Odysseus drifts at sea for 9 whole days before ending up at the home of the goddess Calypso. Now, Calypso wants what she wants, and she wants Odysseus. She promises him a lavish life and immortality, but he resists this temptation. He just wants his mortal life, his wife, and his son. He's eventually let go because Zeus commands Calypso to let him go and help him build a raft so he can sail home. And on his way home from captivity, Poseidon sends a storm which wrecks Odysseus' raft. And of course, he did this out of revenge for what Odysseus did to his son. There were many other trials that he had to survive, but eventually Odysseus does make it home to his wife and his son. Everything that he's wanted for the last 20 years. But after surviving cyclopses, sirens, and literal whirlpools, what does he come home to? He can't just shout, "Honey, I'm home." No. He has to test everyone, hide who he was, fight a household of suitors who were trying to wed his wife, and then emotionally relearn how to be a husband, a father, and a king. Home wasn't the same. He wasn't the same. Classic reintegration crisis. We can also relate this to Frodo. Poor, traumatized, sweet Frodo Baggins. He went from destroying the One Ring to sitting in the Shire trying to enjoy a cup of tea, and it just didn't hit the same anymore. No amount of second breakfasts could put him back together. Now, we have talked a lot about Frodo on this channel, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him here. There's a couple of links in the description if you want to hear more about him and the connections we've made between his story and our real lives. So, why did nothing feel the same in the Shire anymore? Because journeys change us on a cellular level, and returning requires us to face the truth. You can't go back to the person you were before. Identity after transformation is messy. Stories teach us that the real battle isn't always external, it's internal reconstruction. Take Aang from The Last Airbender. He saves the world at 12 years old. 12 years old. And he doesn't just defeat Fire Lord Ozai, he ends a century long war. Psychologically, that makes him a child carrying the weight of a global peace treaty. So, what? Does he go back to being a goofy airbender kid? Does he become a spiritual leader? Does he learn how to just chill? His challenge afterward isn't bending or fighting, it's belonging. He's no longer just the air nomad kid, he's the avatar, a symbol. His home is gone, his people are gone, and he has to redefine what being the last of something even means. He has to figure out who he is without the crisis that defined him. Let's go back to Frodo. His trauma isn't just metaphorical, it is textbook PTSD. J.R.R. Tolkien, who survived World War I, wrote Frodo's return as a mirror of soldiers coming home from war. He experiences hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and intrusive memories. These are all documented in modern PTSD criteria. Luke Skywalker, same deal. And it wouldn't be a hero's journey episode if we didn't mention Luke. My last hero's journey episode is linked in the description down below, and we talk a lot about Luke Skywalker. He goes from farm boy to mythic figure in the span of just a few years. But after defeating the Empire, he has to navigate the existential vacuum. Viktor Frankl wrote about how when life's meaning shifts, you must create a new one. Luke struggles because the crisis that shaped him no longer defines him. After Vader, after the Empire, after space therapy, Luke has to decide what it means to be a Jedi in a world that suddenly doesn't need Jedi in the same way. Psychologist James Marcia describes how people hit identity foreclosure when a chapter ends and they lose the role that gives them their meaning. Heroes experience identity diffusion until they form a new one. And then there's Wanda. Wanda, I accidentally rewrote reality again, Maximoff. Her post-quest identity is not triumphant. It's fractured. She loses vision, her children, her sense of purpose. Every time she tries to build a home, her grief rewrites reality. She's a perfect example of someone who becomes too powerful too quickly without emotional grounding. Every time she returns home, she's forced to confront the emotional rubble that comes after massive power, massive grief, and massive transformation. We deep dived into Wanda in episode 2. If you'd like to know how grief can make you a villain or a hero, check that out. It's linked in the description down below. Returning home isn't just a location shift, it's an identity shift, a recalibration, a reintroduction to yourself. Here's the sneaky truth about endings. They're rarely actual endings. Heroes always experience something called ambiguous loss, coined by Pauline Voss. This is when something ends physically but not emotionally. The end of a war doesn't end the weight of it. Let's bring it back to our examples. Odysseus comes home and then has an entire epilogue. He can't simply resume his throne. He has a second journey, confronting resentment, rebuilding relationships, and navigating consequences. It's closure without comfort. Frodo returns and then chooses to leave. His ending isn't a celebration, it's acknowledgement that healing doesn't always happen in the place where pain occurred. He leaves the Shire because it's no longer a place that his soul recognizes. Aang spends years rebuilding a world and restoring balance, and then realizes balance is a daily practice. His story continues long after the war ends. Korra later inherits the consequences of decisions Aang made, proving that closed chapters ripple forward. Luke destroys the Empire and then must rebuild a legacy. His ending doesn't end with the return of the Jedi. His failures with Ben Solo lead to exile, guilt, and rebirth decades later. Wanda ends one chapter, and grief writes the next one for her. Endings are transitions disguised as closure. Doorways, not walls. Psychology calls this closure fallacy. The belief that once you complete the big quest, the graduation, healing, leaving the toxic job, starting the new life, that everything will fall neatly into place. But life is messier, softer, and more ambiguous. There is no perfect bow, there is no fade to black, only the continuation of becoming. Are you expecting closure when what you really need is continuation? Here's the part nobody warns you about. When you come back from a transformational season in your life, whether it's a breakup, a spiritual awakening, a loss, a degree, a big success, or a big failure, your world will look the same, but you won't. Odysseus's biggest challenge isn't the monsters. It's pretending to be normal again. He's seen too much, survived too much, and changed too much. Yet his people expect him to rule as he did before he left for war. He has to earn back trust, renegotiate relationships, and rebuild his connection to a world that moved on without him. Aang's reintegration isn't physical, it's emotional. After saving the world, how does a child return to simple pleasures? How does he laugh freely knowing that genocide, war, and suffering shaped his destiny? Reintegrating for Aang means reconciling innocence with wisdom. Wanda's story shows us what happens when reintegration is attempted without healing. She keeps trying to build a normal life structured around unresolved grief and identity fractures. And reality bends under that pressure. She reflects how reintegration can crumble when the internal world is still in chaos. All right. I said I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on him, but Frodo may be the most powerful example of reintegration difficulty in all of fantasy. His journey doesn't end when the ring is destroyed. That's just the physical climax. The emotional ending begins when Frodo returns to the Shire and discovers he can no longer belong to the life he once loved. The Shire itself hasn't changed. Frodo has. Trauma, sacrifice, and the weight of the ring have altered him so deeply he becomes a stranger among familiar faces. Psychologically, Frodo displays hypervigilance, difficulty relaxing, emotional numbing, avoidance, and existential displacement, all of which directly mirror modern PTSD frameworks. His inability to reintegrate is not failure. It's an honest portrayal of someone whose inner world no longer aligns with the outer one. His departure to the Undying Lands is not an escape, but a metaphorical acknowledgement. Sometimes healing requires a new landscape entirely. Psychologists call these types of experiences post-transition lag. It's that strange, hollow feeling when life has resumed its regular pace, but your inner world is still catching up. But here's your reality check. You're going to feel out of place in your old routines. You're going to feel disconnected from people who once felt like home. And you will crave a new quest to escape the discomfort of stillness. But remember this: reintegration is a sacred act. It's where the magic becomes lived wisdom. The journey changes you, but the return transforms your life. What familiar space no longer fits who you've become? Endings force us to step into a new version of ourselves. And a great way to bring endings into the real world is through Bridges' transition model. According to Bridge, every ending contains the ending, of course. The first phase of transition begins when people identify what they are losing and learn how to manage these losses. They determine what is over and being left behind and what they will keep. Then there's the neutral zone. People go through an in between time when the old is gone and the new isn't fully operational. It is when the critical psychological realignments and repatternings take place. It's the very core of the transition process. This is the time between old reality and a sense of identity and the new one. People are creating new processes and learning what their new roles will be. They're in flux and may feel confusion and distress. The neutral zone is the seedbed for new beginnings. And lastly, there is the new beginning. Beginnings involve new understandings, values, and attitudes. Beginnings are marked by a release of energy in a new direction. They are an expression of a fresh identity. Well-managed transitions allow people to establish new roles with an understanding of their purpose, the part they play, and how to contribute and participate most effectively. As a result, they feel reoriented and renewed. All the heroes we talked about today moved through all three of these steps, finding themselves on the other side of their concluded journey. Aang spends years teaching others how to rebuild peace because his story evolved from war to wisdom. Luke's withdrawal isn't a failure, it's a crisis of meaning. Wanda continuously closes chapters, but her endings are chaotic because she hasn't found internal stability. She's a living metaphor for unresolved grief. Frodo's choice to leave Middle-earth is a metaphor for stepping away from what no longer supports your healing. It's saying, this life was good, but it can't be my life anymore. In psychology, this is a search for coherent self-story after collapse. So, as we wrap up this first season of The Grounded Mage, it's fitting that we're talking about endings, because we're standing in one. Not a final ending, just the end of a chapter. A bit like Frodo sailing west, or Aang closing his eyes after a long day of restoring balance, or Odysseus finally letting himself sleep in his own bed. Season finales aren't a goodbye. They're a reflection, a breath, a torch passed to the next version of you, the one who will carry what you've learned into chapters ahead. And just like every hero who returns home a little wiser, a little bruised, and a lot transformed, you too have completed a season of your own journey. So, fellow mages, as you walk through the threshold of your own return, whether it's the end of a relationship, a job, a dream, a habit, or even a personal season, remember this: endings are not the loss of magic. They're the invitation to discover how to use it. Thank you for joining me this season for the spells, the stories, the psychology, and the mythic mayhem. I can't wait to come back in January with more stories, more lessons, and more resources to help you continue on your hero's journey. I will leave you with these questions today. How has your identity changed after a major chapter in your life ended? Where in your life are you trying to return to normal, even though you've outgrown it. Remember, your transformation doesn't mean it's the end of your journey. It's just the chance for you to embark upon a new one. Until next season, fellow mages, make it make magic.